Hi, good evening. Welcome to the New York City Solidarity Table of Franciscans Action Network webinar on faith, farming, and U.S. policy. How proposed agriculture bills address climate change. I'm Brother Paul Crawford, and I'm a member of the New York City Solidarity Table, and I'm so glad you were able to join us tonight. We have a lot of wonderful guests to talk to us about this on such an important matter. Everybody is muted. The chat function, if you have questions during the talks, you can write them up. It will go directly to the person who is taking care of getting the question and answer period ready at the end of the talk, and will not be seen on the screen, so don't worry about that. Also, according to law, we have to say this is being recorded for use at a further time also. So as we prepare for our talk, we've invited a member of our New York City Solidarity Table to give us a reflection. So I'd like to introduce to you right now Dr. Julie Leininger-Pichard, who is a professor emeritus and the writer of the book, which just received the Catholic Media Award for History, on Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day. Julie.
Thank you, Brother Paul. In the Franciscan spirit, as we endeavor to help our endangered planet, let us recall the words of that son of St. Francis, Pope Francis. In his groundbreaking environmental encyclical, Laudato Si', Francis wrote, "Now is the time for courageous action aimed at restoring dignity to the excluded and at the same time protecting nature." In fact, Francis quoted those words in his address to Congress. He also held up to Congress two visionary spiritual figures, Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton. Today, there are more than 200 Catholic worker houses of hospitality in the U.S. and beyond, communities where people try to literally live out the works of mercy. About 24 of them are Catholic worker farms. The famous spiritual writer Thomas Merton also saw the works of mercy as wedded to care for creation. No wonder that it was in Dorothy Day's Catholic Worker newspaper that Merton published his prophetic environmental piece, The Wild Places. More than 50 years ago in that article, Merton warned of the many dangers to our natural world. And like Pope Francis and like Franciscans everywhere, Merton and Day always found great inspiration in Francis of Assisi. Like Franciscans everywhere, yes. For instance, like a Capuchin Franciscan who, prior to entering the order, was a volunteer at St. Francis Catholic Worker Farm in upstate New York, Father Tom McNamara. Currently, Father Tom is a pastor in New York City where, yes, he has a vegetable garden. Works of mercy, care for creation. So let us ourselves turn to St. Francis. Let us pray as he prayed. Praised be you, Laudato Si', praised be you, with all your creatures, my Lord, through our sister Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us. Praise my Lord, and give him thanks, and serve him with great humility. Amen.
Thank you, Julie. And now, as the Franciscan Action Network teaches us so well, it's not just being educated on policy, it's doing something about it. And one of our founding members of this table, of the Franciscan Solidarity Table, Julia McGinney, is also coordinator of the Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation Committee at Holy Name of Jesus, St. Gregory the Great Parish in Manhattan, a member of the Metro New York Catholic Climate Movement Steering Committee, and involved with the Catholic Crisis Policy Organization. Ms. McGinney, a retired nurse and biopharma quality risk management professional, has a BA in anthropology from Fordham University, will now share with us about the bills and how to be active with them.
Thanks, Brother Paul. The Climate Crisis Policy Earth Bill Network, or CCP as we call it, is a nationwide organization. Members from a variety of environmental and faith-based groups have collaborated on this project. For the past several years, CCP volunteers have scrutinized many of the bills proposed in Congress that have some bearing on the climate crisis. The express intent of climate crisis policy is to identify those bills that would have a measurable effect on greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere, while at the same time supporting social justice. You can send the next slide, Kelly. Last year, CCP supported and advocated for 10 specific bills as represented on this slide, along with their bill numbers. The bills concern pesticides, materials, agriculture and land preservation, forests and wetlands, fossil fuel management, and environmental justice and just transition. As you may note, the American Innovation and Manufacturing Leadership Act was actually passed into law in 2020. The CCP website, which is climatecrisispolicy.org, provides considerable details about the proposed legislation. The adopted district section of the website is where you may register and partner with other constituents in your congressional district to meet and follow up with your senators or congresspersons to gain their sponsorship or support for this legislation. The Earth Bill. The Earth Bill has a section on the CCC website as well. This bill, which is awaiting a congressional sponsor, and you will see the actual bill on the website when you go on, focuses on 3 areas. First, renewable energy by utilities. CCP emphasizes a renewable energy standard because a, quote, clean energy electricity standard sometimes is defined to include modalities that release carbon dioxide and methane, or they themselves require enormous amounts of energy, or are unlikely to be scaled up without enormous expense. The Earth Bill requires energy companies to source the energy they sell from 100% carbon-free renewable energy sources, such as solar, wind, geothermal, tidal, wave, and existing hydropower. The second section of the bill deals with electric vehicle manufacturers. And the third section of the bill is the most relevant of our discussion today, since it concerns 100% regenerative agriculture produced by agricultural practices, produced by industrial plant and animal corporations. These are the big, large farms, not the small farms. It focuses on agricultural methods that pull carbon from the atmosphere and sequester it in the ground. Regenerative farming with no chemical fertilizers or pesticides are a major feature of this bill. And Brother Paul will introduce our speakers. We're going to be talking about policies in these bills and the background and why they're important.
Thank you, Julia. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker tonight, who comes from a background of service to people and to the poor. Adam Zupkit currently serves as the counsel to U.S. Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey. In this role, Adam advises Senator Brooke on issues related to food policy, agriculture, and animal welfare. Before his employment in the Senate, Adam was Deputy Mayor for Economic Development for the city of Newark, New Jersey. Prior to working in City Hall, Adam operated a law office primarily devoted to providing pro bono legal services in Newark to residents in need, with the focus on providing representation to low-income tenants. In 2006, Adam received the Pro Bono Attorney of the Year Award from Essex County Legal Services, Volunteer Lawyers for Justice program, in recognition of his service and dedication to meeting the legal needs of indigent persons. It's my pleasure to introduce Adam, please. Welcome.
Thank you, Paul, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak tonight. I will talk about a number of the bills that were on that list, bills that Senator Booker is leading on in the Senate and has been working on for several years. I want to take a step back and start just talking for a minute or two about sort of why we're focusing on this, set of bills that you're going to hear about. It's in important part to address climate change and because of the climate crisis, but there's really a lot more to it. And so, so Senator Booker and I, when we came to Washington from Newark, and started working on food and agriculture policy issues, we really just saw that our federal food and farm system is a very, very broken system. It is a system that just does not fundamentally reflect our collective values. And it's a system that is broken for workers, for food system workers and for farm workers. The COVID pandemic really exposed sort of the conditions in the meat packing plants that workers were getting sick and dying in really high numbers. We have farm workers who are outside being exposed to toxic pesticides on a regular basis. We have, independent family farmers who are being forced off their land and into bankruptcy because of the sort of structure of the current system. We have a system that's really harmful to rural communities where you have residents living near massive manure lagoons on these factory farms where residents can't go outside their houses because of the smell and the respiratory diseases that they get. It's a system that's terribly, terribly broken for farm animals, where we have God's creatures being treated in a way that is so cruel that really all of us are forced to sort of look away rather than recognize the daily reality for billions of our fellow creatures, the suffering that we're inflicting on them in this system. It's a system that's broken for all of us in terms of the food that it ultimately produces and the diets that Americans have been adopting, where we have 50% of the population of the United States is pre-diabetic or has type 2 diabetes. 25% of our teenagers are pre-diabetic or have diabetes, and the numbers in communities of color are even worse in terms of the exponential way that diabetes and childhood obesity have been increasing for African American children, for children in indigenous communities, and then we have a system that, from a climate change perspective, there's been reports just in the last week or two that have been published in scientific journals showing that we've potentially been substantially underestimating. We've known that our food system is one of the biggest drivers of climate change, but now this most recent report said that we may have actually been undercounting it and underestimating it, and maybe as much as 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions that are driving climate change come from our global food system. And so it is a system that Senator Booker is very focused on trying to, over the coming months and years, begin to transform. And I think the senator sees a growing movement in our country of awareness, where people are becoming more and more committed to trying to create a more just food system, a system that reflects our values. And so that's sort of the bigger picture and background. And now I'll talk about several of the bills. The first bill that I want to talk about is the Justice for Black Farmers Act. And so the Justice for Black Farmers Act is a bill that, yes, there's the slide, is an attempt to comprehensively address the well-documented history of discrimination by USDA against Black farmers over the last 100 years. And so, and I mentioned all the ways that our food system is unjust and broken, and I didn't even include in that this issue of the sort of systemic racism the federal government inflicted on Black farmers and other farmers of color as well. And so in 1920, there were nearly 1 million Black farmers in our country, and today there are less than 50,000. And over the course of that century, Black farmers, Black families have lost millions of acres of farmland. Somewhere between 15 and 20 million acres is probably the best estimate, which translates into hundreds of billions of dollars of generational wealth that these Black families were robbed of because of their inability to access USDA programs, discrimination in lending, all types of practices that have been well documented in U.S. Commission of Civil Rights reports and other reports. And so this bill does a whole bunch of things. It puts reforms in place at USDA to end that discrimination once and for all. It creates a new land grant program to try to restore some of that land base that's been lost. It would take a number of steps to try to protect the remaining Black farmers that we have from losing their land. And so that includes in the bill putting a foreclosure moratorium in place and ultimately forgiving the USDA debt of the Black farmers that we have left. And in the American Rescue Plan, in the budget reconciliation, the big $1.9 trillion COVID bill that Congress passed back in March, there was $5 billion allocated for Black farmers and other socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, other indigenous farmers and Latino farmers and others who have suffered discrimination. It would forgive their debt with USDA, and there's another $1 billion to provide other assistance to them to try to begin to address this history of injustice and to take some first steps toward justice. And so that is the Justice for Black Farmers Act, which the Senator Booker, Senator Warnock, others were made a big push to get the debt relief and other provisions back in March, but we know we have a lot more work to do as we move towards the next farm bill to get the rest of the bill enacted into law. The next bill I want to tell you about is the Farm System Reform Act. And so the Farm System Reform Act is a bill that would do several things to try to sort of create a more just food system, a food system that reflects our values. And so it would make reforms to our antitrust laws to try to level the playing field for small family farmers. Right now, you have these massive integrated meat packing companies like Tyson's and Smithfield, and they contract with family farmers, but they sort of set all the rules. And you see that picture there with all those barns, those structures, where that's essentially where all the animals are crammed into. And then that big lagoon that you see in the forefront of the picture is actually the waste from all those animals goes through slats in the floor, it gets pumped into that massive manure lagoon, and then they end up spraying it onto the local fields, but it's in quantities that are far too much to be absorbed by the soil. And so that was the condition I described before, where you have primarily low-income communities of color that live near these factory farms that then have all types of public health and other negative consequences from this method of farming. And so the bill would, the heart of the bill, it would put a moratorium on new large factory farms like what you see there, and it would phase them out entirely by 2040, and it would create a $10 billion per year grant program for farmers that want to transition from this system to a more regenerative agriculture system, whether planting crops or having livestock in a pasture-based system. And so this bill is something that is also important from a climate change perspective, because that big manure lagoon that you see there is a massive source of methane emissions. And so the structure of this requires the growing of massive amounts of soy and corn to feed to these animals, because they're not just outside like they historically would have been on a farm, sort of grazing and eating outside, but instead we have to use hundreds of millions of acres. You know, when you see the rainforest in Brazil being chopped down, really that's because either for grazing of livestock, or in a lot more instances, it's to grow the soy and the corn to come back and feed these factory farmed animals. And so from a climate change perspective, it's a massive part of how the food system contributes in such a disproportionately large way to climate change. And there's all types of other environmental harms, water pollution and air pollution, but you know, for the sake of time, I'll move on to the other bills I want to quickly touch on. The third bill is a merger moratorium bill. And so, you know, I described how our current system, it's broken for workers, for family farmers, for rural communities, for animals, for all of us as consumers, for the planet from a climate change perspective. But there are a handful of large integrated multinational companies and their stockholders and their shareholders for whom this system works great. And so we're not going to be able to reform the system unless we have antitrust reforms and unless we break up. So for example, there's 4 meat packing companies. There's 4 companies that essentially produce our meat, that have slaughterhouses that turn these animals into ultimately the food we eat. And 4 companies control 80-something% of the market. And so if you're a farmer or a rancher, that means you have very few options of who you can sell your livestock to. And so those big companies, they put all types of practices in place to benefit themselves and harm the farmers and the ranchers. And so there's an antitrust law called the Packers and Stockyards Act that was passed 100 years ago, back after this book, The Jungle, came out, that ripped the lid off and showed how terrible the conditions are in the meatpacking industry. And what that statute was supposed to do was prevent these big meatpacking companies from getting consolidated and getting so big that they have this disproportionate economic and political power. And for 50 years or so, the law was enforced, and there was a lot more small companies and small facilities and a lot more competition in the marketplace and fair prices and transparency. But now we've sort of stopped enforcing this antitrust law and other antitrust laws. And so these companies have, they're even bigger now than they were 100 years ago when these antitrust laws were first passed. So this bill would put a moratorium on any new mergers in any new big mergers, any big ag mergers. And it would, when we reintroduce the bill this Congress, it will also have a look back provision so that the Department of Justice and FTC can look back at some of the mergers that have been approved and potentially break those companies up if they find that they shouldn't have been approved and they've been harmful to competition and to all of us. And then, because really there's no way to do a lot of these other things we want to do in reforming the system until we address this issue of corporate concentration. The second to last bill that I'll mention is a bill focused on pesticides that would put a ban in place for some of the most toxic pesticides that other countries have already banned, pesticides that are causing the near extinction of our pollinators, pesticides that cause all types of diseases, from Parkinson's disease to developmental disabilities in children, to birth defects, to terrible harm to the farm workers that have to work with them. And this would reform the process by which pesticides are approved, and it would also outright ban some of the most toxic pesticides which the EU has banned some of them, Canada has banned some of them, and we, just because of the sort of regulatory capture in our system, have allowed these companies to prioritize profits over our collective health. And so this is a bill that Senator Udall had led on last Congress, and he retired. So Senator Booker and others will be picking up the mantle this Congress. And then lastly, and the most relevant from a climate change perspective bill that I want to talk about is the Climate Stewardship Act. The Climate Stewardship Act is a bill focused on natural climate solutions. So currently in the United States, our forests, our wetlands, our soils absorb 10, 11, 12%, something like that, of all the emissions that we put out from cars and electricity and everything. 10 to 12% of it is currently absorbed in these carbon sinks. And this bill would invest heavily in those natural climate solutions. So plant billions of trees, restore millions of acres of coastal wetlands. And the heart of the bill is really investing in farmers and ranchers as part of the solution to climate change by using existing voluntary USDA conservation programs to incentivize the types of practices that we know from a soil health perspective, from a carbon sequestration perspective, is very important for a climate change perspective in order to absorb a lot more carbon. And the co-benefits of investing in these natural climate solutions by planting trees and restoring wetlands and creating healthy, focusing on regenerative agriculture and healthy soils, is that we make farms and rural communities more resilient. We protect our drinking water. We create habitat for wildlife and for pollinators and to, increase biodiversity. There's just a long list of, it's not just about sequestering carbon, it is about caring for creation and restoring some of the damage, undoing some of the damage that we've done. And so Paul had mentioned earlier that, for all of us, it's not just about being educated, but it's, doing something about it. And I think for all of us, we can sort of do things in the macro and in the micro in terms of we can work on public policy and try to change the laws and try to implement practices. But then when it comes to our food system, all of us every day are participating in it. And so we can, through our food choices, really impact, because look, ultimately trying to win some of these battles in Congress or in state legislatures, it's going to be very, very difficult. The financial and economic and political power of the stakeholders that we're going up against, it's not to say we can't win, but it's not going to be quick or easy. And the fastest way to effectuate change is on the demand side. If all of us start saying that the food, where we're going to spend our money and the food that we're going to eat, whether we want to be vegetarian or vegan or not, if we even just want to, eat animal products, there's ways to do it where we can know the farmers that we're buying from, that we could go to farmers markets and farm stands and support the farmers and the ranchers who are engaging in the practices that we're trying to incentivize through this legislation. But that's really the biggest thing, is to try to create as much public awareness and change the system that way as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Anybody who can quote Sinclair Lewis in regards to ecology is great in my book. And just to remind people, if you have questions for Adam, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them near the end of the program when we have the question and answer period. Thank you, Adam, once again. Well done. Next up is Matt Russell. Matt is the executive director of the Iowa Interfaith Power and Light, an interfaith organization empowering Iowans of faith and conscience to take bold and just climate action. Matt co-owns and operates Coyote Run Farm with his husband, Patrick. He speaks and writes about how families are called to climate action, and we enjoy his columns of the National Catholic Reporter. Matt, thank you for coming.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for everyone on the call or the Zoom meeting. caring so much about agricultural and natural resource solutions to the climate crisis and other environmental justice issues. And as Jillian had just shared, that these are intersectional issues, right? There's no way that we can solve the climate crisis if we continue to perpetuate inequity, racial injustice, undermining the ability of smaller farmers to innovate and reap the benefits of that innovation. So I really appreciate everyone being together and putting together this panel. I want to talk a little bit about the solutions to the climate crisis through agriculture. There's a lot of talk about that right now. And there's just an amazing amount of federal legislation, there's state policy out there. There's just a lot of effort. And when I started at Iowa Interfaith Power and Light 3 years ago, I pitched the board that if you hire me, we're going to work with farmers to lead on climate change. I've been working on this since 2013 as a farmer myself, and some work that I was doing, and I was really concerned that we're not centering farmers. We're centering agribusiness. We're centering agricultural credit. We're centering trade, but we're not centering farmers. And so I've been really passionate about this. And in Iowa, my take was, if we can get farmers talking about being part of the solution, we can change the conversation, and it changes the politics. And here's what the challenges to solving the climate crisis are not technological. I mean, there's technological challenges, but that's not what's stopping us as a global community from solving this problem. It's a moral and political problem. And so when we work with farmers, we're very specific and focused on what's a moral and political path forward to change things up. And so there's a number of things that are out there in all of these bills. There are a lot more bills. There's the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis that made suggestions on climate and agriculture. But there's kind of two real important things happening here. We've got public policy and we've got markets. And as farmers, we really need to think about how are we utilizing both of those to start to incentivize the changes that we actually need. And the science is pretty clear, and you get a bunch of ag scientists together and they all talk about what we need, but then they're not willing to recognize that we're not getting there, right? It's one thing to say this is what we need, but then we don't have that happening. So what we did with farmers is we brought them into church basements, got them talking to each other, and they developed a pretty simple message. And it's a why, who, how. Why climate change is a really important problem, like maybe the most important problem that we're facing right now. I mean, it's not really just climate change, it's all the things leading up to global warming and climate change and inequity. Climate change is the feedback, right? That we're out of sync, we're out of right relationship. But it's a big problem. So why big problem? Who? Farmers, because we solve problems. That's what we do, we're problem solvers. Core identity. And then how do we do that? Farmers need to lead in innovating and changing the economics so that when we innovate, we get paid for it. And that we get paid for ecosystem services and other things that, clean energy and other things that we can do on our farms that make a difference. I hear sometimes we talk about consumer demand, and that's important, but consumer demand is very tiny compared to public policy and democracy. And I think figuring out how we elevate the voices of farmers politically around the direction that we know agriculture needs to go, and then that we're following that with public policy. So we're really doing a lot of pre-work with getting farmers engaged rather than just specific policy. But get that message out there that farmers are part of the solution, that foresters and ranchers, that we have to be part of the solution. And it's really disruptive. The forces that are trying to stall climate action understand politics really well. And they've been doing identity politics really well. So they organize people around fear, division, and people are very committed. They're not necessarily the majority, but they're vocal and they're very committed to speaking that political message of, you know, it's a hoax, it's incredible disruption. You know, electric cars are gonna ruin transportation. Electric cars are gonna destroy biofuels, right? Like, and on the climate action side, we haven't been as strategic with our political efforts, and that's what I'm talking about with farmers, is that unleashing the power of the farmer voice to engage in leadership for the change. And the disruption is positive, potentially, but it's really challenging for the top of the supply chain. So if we did clean energy led by farmers, minimum tillage, innovated and led by farmers, integrating livestock, right? So putting livestock back on the land and integrating those systems rather than have them siloed. Planting something, cover crops and other things, growing all the time, permaculture, and then extending the crop rotation, growing a wider diversity of crops and livestock. If we did that and we paid farmers to innovate around those problems, in 10 years, we could change the whole agricultural system. Farmers could do it. It's not that hard for them to do. We use a lot of the same technology we have. We build new technology. We create new relationships, new markets. It could happen pretty quickly. And that could all be a positive benefit for farmers. But if we did that, it would undermine, it would be very difficult for agribusiness to make that change in 10 years. So we're really talking about a political situation where are we getting what we need on the land and having it be led by the folks who can do the fastest action at the best cost, the most efficient? Or are we allowing only top-down solutions that slow things down, that talk about how great things are? We're going to change a few things on the edges, but the status quo is going to remain. And I can tell you that what's happened in Iowa since COVID is this year in Iowa, we're planting a record number of corn and soybeans. We're going to be at 23 million plus acres of corn and soybeans. The exact opposite of what we need to do. We need to plant about maybe 17 million acres of corn and soybeans, and then lots of other crops. So the crux of all this is really, how do we use democracy and public policy? Because as the previous speaker was talking about, all these billions of dollars, and she's absolutely right, the billions of dollars that have gone out, those are all supporting status quo. They're not supporting change, they're supporting status quo. What do indigenous farmers come into if we can empower them to lead? Changes. Black farmers, changes. Latinx farmers, changes. Smaller farmers, changes. So investing in them is really important, elevating their leadership, and then shaping policy that unleashes the power of farmers to innovate, and that we get these ecosystem services. They are as important to the world as another bushel of soybeans, right? It's not either or, it's both and, but ecosystem services are every bit as important to integrate into agriculture as increasing yields of a narrow set of commodities. So I just want to mention the Agricultural Resilience Act, because I know I think I'm almost over time here. This is a really interesting piece of legislation because what it does is it runs through all of USDA and all of farm policy, climate resilience and mitigation. And I'll just mention, if I can find my notes here. It adds climate adaptation and mitigation as a resource concern. That's a huge game changer, because then CSP, CRP, EQIP, we can start to build in practices that are rewarded with cost share and incentive payments around these resource concerns. Right now, that doesn't hardly exist at all. So that's a huge change. And it puts producers and at the center of meaningful and long-lasting policy action on climate change. So it really focuses on what I've talked about, that leadership. It focuses on farmers being able to do that and lead it. So I'll quit there and can answer questions.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, we're going to go to Kelly Molson, who was kind of put this all together, and she's going to help with the questions. Kelly?
Yeah, so thank you to all of our speakers. That was really insightful. So the first question that we have, I think it's mostly for Adam, is who's sponsoring these bills? And congratulations to Senator Booker for being a leader with these incredible bills. And do we have a sense of how much support there is in the Senate for these bills? How can we help garner support for them, and what needs to happen?
So thank you for the question. Right now, there's different levels of support for some of these different bills. So the bills have been introduced in the Senate, some also in the House, and have sort of different sets of co-sponsors. I think that, you know, the last bill that Matt was talking about, as well as the Climate Stewardship Act, you know, are bills that, at least in part, have probably the clearest path forward this year. To the extent there's going to be a big infrastructure, climate change, you know, sort of Build Back Better next bill that the president has been talking about. And right now there's some bipartisan negotiations, but ultimately I think there's likely to be just, you know, trillions of dollars of sort of investment in infrastructure and climate change. And I think in that legislation, it's our collective job, you know, sort of me as a staffer in the Senate and Senator Booker and all of us here to work on it sort of politically and legislatively. And then just as everyone who's watching tonight, sort of helping to push from the outside, reaching out to your members of Congress, working with groups like Franciscan Action Network to advocate for investing in as big of a way as possible in farmers and ranchers and rural communities as part of the solution to climate change.
So the next question, it says, there would seem to be a significant amount of metanoia in terms of people's perceptions of the food and ag reforms required to make this a more just industry. Without a change of heart, I feel the legislators will side with the money, i.e. industrial ag. Are there programs which are reaching out to support the boots on the ground farmers who are trying to support sustainable ag, which might create the society change required to get the legislation of this nature through?
I can take a crack and then if Matt wants to add to it, but yeah, progress is to using existing conservation programs or tailoring them in a way that's focused on climate change, like Matt mentioned, and just making, you know, investing billions of dollars a year for the next 10 years to create the kind of system that we want to create, right? Rather than focusing on fighting the current system, work on, there's a lot of farmers out there who are feeling the effects of climate change, who are on the front lines of climate change and extreme weather, and with conservation technical assistance from USDA and with investments to help them cover the costs of transitioning to these practices, to these regenerative agriculture practices, planting cover crops, doing no-till, doing rotational grazing. You know, I think there's the opportunity to transform tens of millions of acres, ultimately hundreds of millions of acres towards, you know, this model that would be beneficial to all of us.
Thank you all so much for an informative and at times heated discussion about policy, and very grateful for your participation, Matt and Adam, and Jillian and Mr. Gregory, who added so much from policy to experience to a reflection upon discrimination over the ages and the call not for discrimination, but for more of the ground up policy. So we invite people not just to be educated about this, but to go to the ccp.org website and sign up. You can sign up according to your congressional district, and you can join everybody in that organization on July 2nd at the members of Congress and Senate's office to remind them about climate change and the need for the need for legislation immediately. And on behalf of the New York's Solidarity Table, I'd like to thank Kelly, Julie, and Julia, and a special word of thanks to Janine Russell from our Office of Franciscan Action Network, who took care of all the media for us. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good night, and let's not just talk, let's go and do. Thank you.